the second anniversary of the Russo-Ukrainian War. By Eastern Courier, former Soviet leader Khrushchev was ever served as official in Ukraine. He has strong personal feelings for Ukraine, for the Troika in the main framework of the Soviet Federation. Between Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, to balance interests, Khrushchev used administrative means. Crimea, which originally belonged to Russia, was transferred to. The reasons given are: solve the water problem in Crimea. The lack of drinking water in Crimea is a historical problem. The water in half of the residential areas is unfit for drinking. Drinking water is very scarce in the grassland areas. Therefore, the Soviet government decided to build the 400-kilometer North Crimean Canal, bringing water from the Dnieper River into Crimea. In order to build this water conservancy project, Crimea was transferred to Ukraine, winning over the Ukrainian Communist Party to gain support in the Politburo, commemorating the 50th anniversary of Ukraine's admission to the Soviet Union. Ukrainian independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the Russians in Crimea are embarrassed. Some say Crimeans want to return to Russia. It is for a better economic environment, political prospects and security guarantee. However, this argument is difficult to justify and seems to be unreasonable. I secretly believe that its real motive may still be national sentiment. Ukraine's pro-Western policies harm Russia's state, so Crimea as a Russian ethnic group. After all, people of the same race and clan feel the same way. Also understandable. Year 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine became independent, marks the beginning of Ukraine's move towards political independence. The Russians in Crimea became restless. Year 2004, the Orange Revolution. This is a political movement led by the Ukrainian opposition aimed at overthrowing pro-Soviet President Kravchuk. The movement eventually led to the rise of pro-Western politician Yushchenko to power, leading to rising sentiment among Crimeans to return to Russia. Year 2014, Ukrainian Revolution. This is another political movement led by the Ukrainian opposition, overthrowing pro-Soviet President Yanukovych. The movement eventually led to the rise of pro-Western politician Poroshenko to power. It also led to renewed sentiment among Crimeans to return to Russia. In year 2014, Russia defended Crimea. Russians' rights were used as an excuse to occupy Crimea without bloodshed. Russia's excuse for this is the instability of the Ukrainian government, and the oppression of ethnic Russians threatens the security and stability of Crimea. On March 16, 2014, under the protection of the Russian army, Crimea holds referendum on abandoning Ukraine and joining Russia. The result is predictable: more than 90% of voters agreed. However, the legality and fairness of this referendum have been disputed, because the General Assembly passed a resolution declaring the referendum invalid. This draft resolution of the United Nations General Assembly was approved by 100 votes. The vote was approved with 11 votes against and 58 abstentions. The United States and EU countries voted in favor, Russia voted against, China, Brazil and other countries abstained. Frankly speaking, the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly may not be completely for gentlemen. What they do, after all, voting is based on the self-interests of each country, rather than under international law. Of course, this international law is also a bit vague. An independence referendum must be approved by the central government. If the central government authorizes it, then the referendum is just a formality. The independence referendum area must be subject to the host countries. Crackdown on discrimination, humanitarian disaster. Anyone can find such a reason even if it is far-fetched. But if a certain region is allowed to hold a referendum at will, if you can be independent, then the world order will definitely lead to chaos. There will never be peace from now on. I secretly think that Russia, with its vast territory and abundant resources, should not covet the tiny land of Crimea. The Black Sea outlet of Crimea is not very attractive either. Russia's most compelling reason to insist on getting Crimea can only be national identity and weaken Ukraine. For this reason, Russian President Vladimir Putin once claimed that after acquiring Crimea, no more seeking other parts of Ukraine. The so-called other regions of Ukraine refer to the ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, gathering area like Crimea, seeking to leave Ukraine and join Russia. First, the armed separatist regime in the eastern Ukraine region fought back and forth with the government forces, Donbas region of eastern Ukraine since April 2014, including Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Armed conflict broke out with government forces. Later, through the mediation of the international community, the two parties to the conflict concluded in September 2014 and February 2015 respectively. A ceasefire agreement was reached in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, and the ceasefire demarcation line was determined. Since then, large-scale armed conflicts have been brought under control, but small-scale exchanges of fire still occur from time to time. The ceasefire on the battlefield does not prevent the continued war of public opinion, so Russia suddenly sent troops to Ukraine on February 24, 2022. The biggest war of this century started. There are different opinions on the reasons, and the main ones are roughly as follows. Russia wants to maintain its sphere of influence in the region, preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. This may be unfounded, because there is one article in the NATO Charter that states countries with territorial disputes cannot join, and Ukraine happens to have a dispute over the sovereignty of Crimea. Russia's influence on Ukraine, especially the Crimean Peninsula, expressing concern over the plight of Russians. Crimea is a peninsula, almost entirely Russian and very independent. No one else can do anything about it. Russia wants to control Ukraine's natural resources, including oil and gas. Russia itself is a major exporter of oil and natural gas, a resource for its neighbors. Although they are coveted, they should not plunder violently. Russia wants to distract from domestic problems and boost Putin's popularity at home. That doesn't mean much. However, judging from the actual strength and intensity of the movements may be of that it's not because of coveting Ukrainian land. Instead, they use force to occupy Ukraine and force Ukraine to compromise in exchange for recognition of Crimea as independence. History is so strikingly similar. Japan followed this pattern when it invaded China. The Marco Polo Bridge incident was not an established policy of the Japanese government. It was an unauthorized action by the Japanese garrison in China. After the incident, the Japanese government continued to expand the scale of its invasion of China despite its mistakes. Its purpose is not to annex China but to so-called 3 months to solve the China problem. The so-called solve the China problem is force China to recognize the independence of Manchukuo, a Japanese puppet, turn North China into a neutral autonomous government, thus cutting off the connection between the hinterland of China and Manchukuo. Sign a reparation treaty. If the Chinese government submits, Japan should withdraw its troops from the border. But the Japanese miscalculated that China would fight to the end, causing Japan to fall into the quagmire of war. So the Russo-Ukrainian War started soon, as long as Ukraine surrendered, recognized the independence of Crimea and full autonomy of Udon. If you sign and pledge the Russian troops, they will definitely withdraw their troops from eastern Ukraine. Before this, Russia had attacked Chechnya and Georgia. The international community did not respond to the use of force. Therefore, Russia habitually believes that this time it will attack Ukraine. Using force is no different than before. After the war, NATO announced that its support for Ukraine is escalating day by day. Such an exaggerated reaction was unexpected by Russia and the international community. But at this moment, Russia is already riding a tiger and can't get off, so it can only bite the bullet and carry on. If Russia had known that NATO's reaction was so violent, it would have acted cautiously. For example, instead of sending troops personally, you can use weapons, financial resources and supplies to fund the armed separatist regime of the Russians in Ukraine, to join the local militia organization, recruit international volunteers to fight in eastern Ukraine. Just like Russia at the beginning, the West also thought that Russia would succumb if it exerted maximum pressure. But think about the consequences. Once Russia surrenders, it means ceding territory and paying reparations. How will Russia continue to mess around in the world from now on? Therefore, Russia will never surrender unless defeated, and if Russia is really defeated, then the end of the earth may not be far away, because Putin said if Russia no longer exists, then why do we need this world? As the war continues today, I'm afraid all parties involved are in trouble. There is a saying in China, the winner is the king and the loser is the bandit. That means now, whoever gives in first must admit it. He is the chief culprit of the war and the sinner of history, since both sides established a large-scale battlefield defense line. Whoever attacks will suffer, but there are no steps to go down, so I can only drag myself down in a small way. Just like the Iran-Iraq war lasted 8 years, just like the Soviet-Afghan war lasted 10 years, until the international community gets tired of it. Therefore, the Russia-Ukraine war is likely to remain low intensity and drag on for a long time. In fact, the low intensity here is already very scary. It is said that in some places, Ukraine has deployed its female soldiers to fight on the front lines. It is also reported that Russia fires about 2,000 artillery shells every day. Ukraine fires approximately 4,000 to 7,000 artillery shells every day, and it takes 1,000 rounds of bullets to destroy an enemy. If we rely on borrowed money to fight the war, then post-war reconstruction and repayment of the loan will probably require the blood and sweat of several generations. If the war had started and ended quickly, the fire would have ceased. Russia should withdraw from the occupied areas in eastern Ukraine. It will be difficult for Russia to withdraw its troops after the war has reached this point. After all, after paying such a big price, there should be some compensation, right? The prolonged protracted war between Russia and Ukraine has become a bleeding wound for the world and must be a tragedy for mankind. But the return of the Cold War between East and West and the reappearance of mutual constraints, more or less inhibiting the occurrence of new possible wars,